They said he came back from the war empty, that there was no laughter left in his house, and nothing in his eyes but dust. And then a woman stepped into that house, one who had also been broken, but not destroyed. Colorado Territory, the high plains at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, 1886. A house that was not waiting. He lived at the edge of the land, where the wind moved freely and the sky felt too wide for one man alone. His farm stood apart from the road, as if it had turned its back on the world. After the war, he returned not as a hero, but as a shadow. He worked, ate, slept, and expected nothing. The woman was brought to him out of necessity, not as a dream, not as hope, but as a solution to a problem. She had lost her family, her home, and her name in a single fire, leaving behind only silence and debt. She was not looking for love, she was looking for a place to survive. The meeting carried no warmth. He regarded her the way he regarded a broken fence line, with the quiet knowledge that it would require work, patience, and effort before it could stand again. There was no curiosity in his gaze, only assessment and restraint. She noticed it immediately and did not mistake it for cruelty. It was distance, carefully maintained. She answered it with caution of her own, watching him from beneath lowered lashes, bracing herself for indifference, for roughness, for the kind of disappointment she had learned to expect. In town, their union had already been shaped into a story that did not belong to either of them. It was spoken of as a solution, a practical arrangement meant to serve convenience rather than feeling, two lives reduced to necessity and bound together by ink and expectation. She felt the weight of those judgments settle on her shoulders the moment she crossed the threshold of his land. He felt it too, though he never turned back to look at the road. From the first day, it became clear that words would not bridge the space between them. He carried his past like a sealed room, one he had learned never to open. The war had taught him that much. She carried the future like fragile glass, something she did not dare to touch for fear it would shatter. Silence became the only ground they shared. The house filled with the sound of footsteps instead of voices. Boots crossed wooden floors, a chair was pulled back, a door closed softly, as if any louder sound might break what little balance existed. They moved around one another with deliberate care, each gesture measured, each action restrained. It felt less like living together and more like learning the shape of unfamiliar terrain. She kept herself useful. She cleaned what did not need cleaning and arranged what was already in order. Her hands stayed busy, not because he demanded it, but because stillness invited memories she was not ready to face. She learned the rhythm of the house quickly, the way light entered through the windows in the morning, the places where the floor creaked, the corner where dust always gathered no matter how often it was swept. He watched these changes without comment. He noticed when a tablecloth appeared where there had been none, when a kettle was set closer to the stove for convenience rather than habit. He noticed because nothing in his life had shifted in years, and now the smallest things were moving. It unsettled him more than he expected. They ate at the same table without looking at one another. The scrape of utensils against plates marked the passing of time. He finished quickly, as if lingering might invite something neither of them knew how to handle. She ate slowly, listening to the room, measuring his presence by the space he occupied. When he stood, she felt it. When he left, the air seemed to settle differently. At night, the house returned to a deeper quiet. She lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring into the dark, counting the spaces between sounds. Sometimes she heard him moving elsewhere in the house. Sometimes she did not. In either case, she slept lightly, ready to wake if necessary. Trust did not come easily. It never had. He slept poorly as well. The ceiling above him felt too close, the walls too still. He was used to wide fields and open air, to nights broken by wind or distant animals. Now there was another presence under his roof, and he did not yet know what it meant. He told himself it was temporary, that time would dull the unease. He had always relied on time to do its work. Morning brought no relief, only repetition, the same restrained glances, the same careful distance. Yet within that restraint, something subtle began to form. He did not intrude on her space. She did not ask questions she was not prepared to hear answered. In a world that had demanded so much of both of them, this quiet respect felt unfamiliar, almost disarming. She noticed that he left certain doors open for her, small permissions offered without announcement. He noticed that she learned his routines and stayed clear of them, never crossing his path unless necessary. These unspoken understandings became their language, sparse, limited, but real. The town watched and waited for failure, for proof that this arrangement would collapse under its own weight. They expected raised voices, sudden departures, evidence that two broken people could not share one life. Instead, what unfolded was slower and harder to define. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing fell apart. Days passed, measured not by milestones, but by continuity. The land demanded attention, and he gave it. The house absorbed her presence gradually, as if adjusting to a new climate. Neither of them spoke of what they had lost. Neither of them spoke of what they might gain. Yet with every shared sunrise and every quiet evening, the space between them changed shape. It was not smaller, not yet, but it became less sharp, less dangerous. Silence no longer felt like a threat. It became something they could both stand inside without flinching. They had not chosen each other. That truth remained. But choice was not the only thing that bound lives together. Sometimes survival did, sometimes endurance, and sometimes the simple act of staying, day after day, without asking for more than the other could give. By the end of that first stretch of days, the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. It exhaled slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether it was allowed. And though neither of them would have named it as such, something had begun. Not love, not trust, but the fragile groundwork that made both possible. The days settled into a pattern that neither of them had chosen, but both obeyed. He rose before the sky changed color, moving through the house with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned not to wake anyone, even when there was no one to wake. The floorboards knew his weight. The door knew the sound of his hand. By the time the first light reached the windows, he was already gone, leaving behind only the faint trace of cold air and the echo of boots that no longer stood by the wall. She woke later, alone in a bed that still felt unfamiliar. The space beside her remained untouched, as if it belonged to another life entirely. She dressed slowly, listening to the house breathe. It creaked, sighed, settled. Every sound reminded her that this place had existed long before her and did not need her to continue standing. She moved through the rooms with care, not out of fear, but out of respect for something fragile she could not yet name. She cleaned because it gave her direction. She scrubbed surfaces already worn smooth by years of use. She folded cloth that carried the scent of dust and sun. She rearranged small things, then put them back where they had been, unsure whether she had the right to change anything at all. The house resisted and accepted her at the same time. It did not welcome her, but it did not push her out. When he returned in the evening, the light was already lower. His movement slowed once he crossed the threshold, as if the land released him only reluctantly. He noticed changes without looking for them. A chair placed straighter, a pot washed and left to dry, the faint warmth lingering in rooms that had once gone cold by habit. He did not comment. He removed his coat, washed his hands, and took his place at the table without expectation. They ate in silence, the sound of utensils marking time more clearly than any clock. He kept his eyes on his plate. She kept her posture still. Neither rushed, neither lingered. The space between them remained untouched, a careful distance neither tried to cross. It was not hostility that kept them apart, but caution shaped by loss. They had both learned that words could demand more than they were willing to give. At night, the house changed again. Shadows lengthened. The wind pressed against the walls and found every small opening. She lit lamps where she thought darkness should not remain. He watched without stopping her, though the dimness had once felt safer to him. When she passed nearby, he stepped aside without thinking. When he moved behind her, she did not flinch. These small adjustments happened quietly, without agreement, without acknowledgement. Some evenings they occupied the same room without purpose. He repaired tools at the table, while she stitched fabric that did not yet belong to anything. The sounds of their work blended into a single rhythm, metal against wood, thread against cloth, breath against breath. The silence held, but it softened. It no longer felt like absence. It became something shared, something that rested rather than pressed. She began to learn the shape of his routines, the way he paused before sitting, the way he stood near windows without looking out, the way his hands sometimes stilled, as if remembering something they could no longer complete. He noticed her habits as well, how she preferred certain corners of the house, how she left doors half open, how she lingered near warmth longer than necessary, as if cold had once taken too much from her. They did not ask questions. The past remained untouched, sealed behind expressions that did not invite inquiry. Yet in the restraint, a fragile balance formed. He did not test her patience. She did not challenge his distance. Each respected the boundaries the other had built to survive. The house responded first. It no longer echoed when footsteps crossed the floor. It no longer felt abandoned when night settled in. Objects remained where they were placed. Light stayed longer. The air held warmth that had nothing to do with fire. What filled the rooms could not be named, only felt in the way silence changed its weight. By the end of the week, they no longer moved like strangers forced into proximity. They moved like people learning the limits of shared space. There was no closeness, but there was steadiness, no affection, but no resistance. The distance between them remained, but it was measured now, deliberate rather than accidental. Under one roof, without promises and without words, something quiet began to take shape. Not trust, not yet, not hope, but the understanding that silence did not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it meant room enough for two broken lives to exist without causing each other harm. The past did not disappear simply because the days moved forward. It lived on in his body, in the way his shoulders tightened at sudden sounds, in the way his hands sometimes curled as if still holding a rifle that was no longer there. Sleep came to him in fragments. When it broke, it carried him back to fields torn open by noise and fire, to moments where survival had depended on speed rather than mercy. He woke before dawn more often than he needed to, sitting still in the dark until the present returned, piece by piece. She carried her own nights. Fire visited her without warning, rising behind closed eyes, filling her chest with heat and ash. She remembered walls collapsing inward, remembered how voices disappeared not gradually, but all at once. Certain smells unsettled her. Sudden movements made her heart race before her mind could intervene. She learned to move carefully even when no one watched, as if caution itself might keep loss from returning. They had learned each other's silences, but not the reasons behind them. What remained hidden did not demand attention until it surfaced on its own. It happened one evening when the wind changed suddenly, slamming a loose shutter against the house's side. The sound tore through the quiet, sharp and unforgiving. Her body reacted before thought arrived. She froze where she stood, breath caught, eyes wide with something far older than the moment itself. He saw it, not as confusion, not as inconvenience, but as recognition. He knew that stillness. He knew the way fear could hollow a person from the inside out. He did not step back. He did not rush forward. He stayed where he was, grounding himself in the floor beneath his feet, allowing the moment to pass without interruption. His presence was steady, unarmed, unguarded. For the first time since his return, he did not reach for the discipline that had kept him alive. He did not force calm into place. He allowed the weight of memory to exist without pushing it down. His breathing slowed not because he commanded it to, but because he chose not to flee from what surfaced. In that stillness, he accepted his own fracture, visible and unprotected. She felt the shift before she understood it. The absence of pressure, the lack of expectation. He was not asking her to recover or to explain. He was not watching her as something fragile that needed to be handled with care. He was simply there, sharing the same space without trying to control it. The fear loosened its grip, not because it vanished, but because it was no longer faced alone. The house seemed to hold its breath with them. The noise faded. The wind moved on. What remained was not relief, but connection shaped by restraint. She became aware of his presence in a new way, not as a distant figure moving through the same rooms, but as someone who understood without intrusion. His steadiness did not come from strength alone, but from the willingness to remain open. In the days that followed, small changes marked the difference. He no longer hid his exhaustion as carefully. She no longer masked her unease behind constant motion. They existed with less armor between them. The silences deepened, but they were no longer empty. They carried acknowledgement, a shared awareness of wounds that did not need to be exposed to be seen. What formed between them did not resemble comfort. It was quieter, more deliberate. It was the recognition that survival had taken something from both of them, and that neither demanded the other be whole. Without promises or explanations, they allowed space for what had been carried inside for too long. In that unspoken understanding, something essential took root. Not healing, not yet, but the knowledge that pain did not have to be hidden to be respected, and that sometimes remaining beside another person without turning away was the most honest form of trust either of them had ever known. The town returned to their lives without ceremony, as it always did. It waited beyond the threshold, patient and observant, ready to measure them against its own expectations. When they entered its streets, the weight of attention settled quickly. Eyes lingered longer than necessary. Judgments formed without permission. She was seen as temporary, as someone passing through circumstances rather than belonging to them. He was regarded as distant, marked by a reputation shaped years earlier and never corrected. She felt the town before she heard it, the way conversations paused when she approached, the way smiles appeared polite but incomplete. She carried herself carefully, aware that every movement was being catalogued. Her past, though unknown in detail, clung to her like a shadow others believed they could sense. She was not asked who she was measured by where she had come from and by how long she was expected to remain. He walked beside her with the same restrained presence he carried everywhere else. He did not position himself in front of her, nor did he drift behind. His steadiness was not performative. It did not demand recognition. When rumors surfaced, when fragments of her history began to circulate without accuracy or mercy, he did not correct them aloud. He did not raise his voice or claim authority over the narrative. He simply remained where he was, unyielding in proximity. That constancy spoke louder than defense ever could. His refusal to distance himself became a statement the town could not ignore. He attended to his business without explanation, included her without hesitation, and did not alter his pace to accommodate comfort or discomfort. The message was not declared, it was demonstrated. She was not an inconvenience to be managed. She was present by choice, and so was he. For her, each step through town shifted something internal. She had learned to move through public spaces as if apologizing for existing, prepared to shrink at the first sign of resistance. This time, she did not disappear into the edges. She stood beside him, felt the ground beneath her boots, and allowed herself to be seen without bracing for rejection. The world felt larger than the house, but it no longer felt hostile. Small acknowledgments followed. A nod held a moment longer. A greeting offered without hesitation. These changes came slowly, unevenly, but they accumulated. She was no longer just a figure attached to circumstance. She became someone recognized through repetition and presence. The town did not welcome her openly, but it adjusted, as places often did when certainty replaced speculation. He observed these shifts with quiet clarity. The town he had withdrawn from years earlier no longer felt like an adversary, but neither did it feel essential. What mattered was the choice to remain engaged rather than retreat. Standing beside her in public required no courage he had not already spent. It required only consistency. As they returned home, the landscape felt altered. The distance between the farm and the town remained the same, but its meaning had changed. The house no longer stood apart as a refuge from the world, but as a place anchored by decision. He understood then that shelter was not built by isolation. It was built by commitment to presence, both within walls and beyond them. Home was not defined by the land he worked or the structure he maintained. It was defined by the act of staying when withdrawal was easier, by choosing connection without spectacle, by allowing the world to see what mattered without explanation. And as the door closed behind them, the space inside no longer felt separate from the world beyond it. It felt aligned, held together by the simple, deliberate choice to remain. The shift in their relationship arrived without announcement. It did not demand attention or name itself. It moved quietly through their days, settling into place the way dust settled after a long journey. There was no moment of clarity that divided before from after. There were only small changes that accumulated meaning over time. One morning, he prepared an extra cup before leaving the house. He placed it where the light would reach it later, not as a gesture meant to be noticed, but as something practical that felt necessary. She found it hours afterward and understood it not as kindness, but as consideration. It did not surprise her. It simply belonged to the day. In the evenings, she began to mark time differently. She paused near the window as the sky dimmed, not from anxiety, but from awareness. His return became part of the landscape, as expected as the lowering sun. When he arrived, there was no relief and no tension. There was completion. The day closed properly once he crossed the threshold. They started working together without discussion. What had once been divided by habit blended into shared effort. He no longer assumed tasks were his alone. She no longer waited to be asked. Their movements aligned gradually, shaped by observation rather than instruction. The land taught them how to cooperate. One adjusted when the other slowed. One continued when the other rested. They shared responsibilities without tally or acknowledgement. Repairs were made before they became problems. Meals appeared without planning. Water was carried. Tools were cleaned and returned. These acts did not carry the weight of sacrifice. They were expressions of a life being maintained together rather than endured separately. At some point, the reason she had come lost its authority. Necessity, once sharp and defining, softened until it no longer explained her presence. She stayed not because she had nowhere else to go, but because leaving no longer appealed to her. The house had ceased to feel like refuge. It felt like choice. He stopped seeing her as obligation long before he realized it. The sense of duty that had framed his actions dissolved quietly. He noticed her absence when she stepped outside. He adjusted his routines with her in mind. Her presence no longer felt like something to manage. It felt essential in ways he did not analyze. They became partners without naming it. In work, they trusted each other's judgment. In silence, they shared space without guarding it. In rest, they allowed themselves to remain close without needing reason. There was no imbalance that demanded correction. There was effort, given freely and received without suspicion. What formed between them was not built on promise or vow. It was reinforced daily by repetition, by the way they returned to the same table, by the way they faced decisions together without discussion of roles, by the way neither sought to leave when staying required patience. The bond that held them did not depend on emotion declared aloud. It rested on consistency, on the quiet understanding that both had chosen this life not because it was required, but because it was preferred. And in that choice, renewed each day without ceremony, their partnership became complete. The farm no longer carried the stillness it once had. Its transformation happened slowly, almost cautiously, as if the land itself needed time to trust change. Near the house, flowers appeared where nothing had grown before. They were not arranged for display, but planted where the soil allowed, tended with patience rather than expectation. She cared for them daily, accepting that some would fail and others would survive. The act itself mattered more than the result. Light remained in the windows long after dusk. The house no longer folded inward when the sun disappeared. Lamps stayed lit, not out of fear of darkness, but because there was no reason to surrender the evening early. From the road, the glow marked the farm as occupied, alive, unashamed of being seen. It was no longer a place that withdrew from the world. Inside, the house reflected continuity. Nothing felt provisional. Objects stayed where they belonged. Wear no longer suggested neglect, but use. The rooms carried warmth shaped by routine and presence. The silence remained, but it had changed its nature. It no longer echoed, it rested. The town noticed in its own time. Curiosity gave way to certainty. The whispers that had once followed them lost their urgency and then disappeared altogether. What had been questioned became ordinary. The union that had once been discussed as a mistake revealed itself through consistency. There was nothing to correct, nothing to expose. Their life together required no explanation. She walked through town with steady posture, neither guarded nor defiant. She belonged there now, not because she had earned approval, but because she no longer sought it. He stood beside her without alteration, unchanged in manner, but no longer isolated by reputation. They were seen not as circumstances bound together, but as a unit shaped by time. The land responded to their presence. Work accumulated into visible results. Repairs lasted. Growth returned where exhaustion had once ruled. The farm no longer existed in a state of survival. It existed in rhythm. Seasons moved through it without resistance, and each left something behind. The past remained near, but it no longer commanded their days. His memories of war surfaced without control, but they no longer defined his movements. He acknowledged them and continued. Her recollections of loss still appeared in quiet moments, but they no longer determined how she stood in the world. What had once governed them became part of the background, present, but no longer dominant. Some evenings they stood together on the porch without intention. The land stretched out before them, marked by effort and time. They looked at it not as something conquered, but as something shared. There was no need to speak. The moment existed fully without words, complete in its simplicity. Their story did not resolve itself with promises or declarations. It concluded in presence, in the shared understanding that remaining was no longer a matter of necessity, but of choice. They had stayed when leaving would have been easier. They had continued when withdrawal offered relief. That decision, repeated without ceremony, became the foundation of everything that followed. Love did not arrive as a sudden feeling. It arrived as consistency, as restraint, as the willingness to stand beside another person without armor or escape. It arrived as the decision to remain, made again and again, quietly. If these quiet stories resonate with you, stories about choice, dignity, and love that does not announce itself, consider subscribing to the channel Dust and Devotion Tales. Here, silence always speaks louder than words.